Hi and welcome to my OCR A A-Level Biology revision session with me, Christine. So today's lesson, I want to look at secretion of insulin in response to the hormonal communication topic, looking at your blood sugar levels. So the first thing I want to do though is I want to take you a step back and remind you about a cell's membrane and the fact that a resting potential in a cell is where there is a potential difference across the plasma membrane. Now when we talk about it in neuronal communication, we tend to talk about the resting potential being minus 70 millivolts. And how that is maintained is due to the sodium potassium pump, which is pumping sodium out of the cell, 3 sodium out, and 2 potassium in. And that creates a concentration gradient inside the cell, which has a high potassium concentration and a low sodium concentration. Now, potassium can leave out of the cell because there is a potassium channel. So potassium will diffuse down its concentration gradient out of the cell. And it's important we understand the role that the sodium potassium pump plays and the fact that it's about generating a concentration gradient. So what we've got is a electrical chemical gradient because we have a high proton concentration inside compared to outside. So let's look then at the beta cell. So we're solely looking at the beta cell because we're looking at what happens to either inhibit or promote the secretion of insulin. So we know that if there is a low glucose concentration, the sodium potassium pump is going to be pumping, and that's going to create a high concentration inside of potassium ions. Now, the resting potential would be about minus 70 millivolts. Now, what happens is because that potassium is at a high concentration, the potassium ions can leave. They diffuse down their concentration gradient, and what that will do is that will generate what's known as hyperpolarized membrane. So the membrane is going to become hyperpolarized, and there are voltage gated calcium channels which are in the membrane of the beta cell. Now, because the membrane has become hyperpolarized, and these are voltage gated calcium channels, they are going to remain closed. If they remain closed, that means that the insulin is going to stay inside the vesicles. It is not going to be secreted. So this is what happens when there is low glucose concentration. We don't want to release any insulin because there isn't enough glucose being transported in the bloodstream as it is. So what we're getting is what's known as the resting state. So the resting state of the beta cell is where the cell membrane is maintaining a very delicate balance of sodiums, potassium, chloride and calcium ions. So this delicate balance on either side ensures that the cell, the beta cell, remains in its resting state. So if I want to check my blood sugar levels, as I did here, a normal blood sugar concentration is about 4 millimoles per litre before a meal. Now, when I took my blood sugar levels, I took it straight after having a meal. And as you can see, the sensor detected that my blood sugar levels were 5.4 millimoles per litre. Now, 2 hours after eating that meal, I took a test again, and you can see here that my sugar levels are rising up, and they're rising up to close to the higher limit of my blood sugar levels. So my blood sugar levels should be between 4 to 8 millimoles per litre. So what's going to happen now? Well, this is where the beta cells need to get involved. Because my blood sugar levels are now high, so I've got a high glucose concentration circulating around in the bloodstream, my beta cells are going to monitor and then secrete insulin. So how this monitoring happens is that when there's a high glucose concentration, glucose can diffuse in through a glucose channel. Now, once that glucose has got into the cell, remember we have got the concentration gradient being established because of my sodium-potassium pump. Well, that glucose is going to be broken down through glycolysis, and then pyruvate is going to make its way into the mitochondria, and that's going to result in respiration occurring. Aerobic respiration, because we're inside the mitochondrion and we're going to be producing a lot of ATP. Now, what you may not have noticed is my potassium channel in my beta cells are very specific. They're called potassium ATP channels. If there is a high concentration of ATP within the beta cell, that is going to bind to this protein, this channel protein, causing it to change its tertiary structure, causing the channel to close. Well, if the channel is closing and our sodium-potassium pump was pumping the potassium into the cell, there is now going to be a high concentration of potassium inside the cell and it cannot leave. The doors have been closed, the channel is closed. Well, what that does is that actually causes what's known as depolarization of the membrane. So the membrane becomes depolarized. And if you remember, my voltage gated calcium channels were voltage gated. If the membrane becomes depolarized to the point where it reaches the threshold value, that is going to mean that those voltage gated calcium channels will open. Calcium can now move in across the membrane into the cytoplasm, and what that causes the vesicles which contain the insulin to now be moved towards the membrane so that the insulin can now be secreted. So the glucose was moving into the cell from a high concentration in the blood to the lower concentration inside the cell. The cell hydrolyzed it through glycolysis, and then aerobic respiration occurred that we ended up with ATP production. ATP was going to close the ATP channel. The membrane becomes depolarized. The voltage-gated calcium channels open. Calcium floods into the cell, causing exocytosis. The insulin is secreted and can now be transported around the bloodstream. What will happen is the insulin will then have an effect on the cells, the liver and the muscle cells, and what that will do is that will result in the blood sugar levels dropping down. So 4 hours after eating my meal, you can quite clearly see that although my glucose levels rose up, they are now coming back down again, and that's because of the response because of insulin being secreted. So the beta cells monitored and secreted the insulin. The insulin then gets transported in the bloodstream to where it needs to go. And I hope you've liked this video. If you have liked this video, please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't already done so, please do check out my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com.